always as stark as that, but Sheth says that the promise of liberalism is very rarely realised for everyone. But sovereign power has to preserve the basic liberal assumptions. So what does it do? It creates exceptions. It rules out certain groups of people as not being eligible for entrance into the promised land, as not being eligible for protection, benefits, voting rights, whatever. As a bonus, if a population is enslaved, or there's an unjust war, or a refugee crisis, or a financial crash, then those disasters can be written off as mistakes, as misapplications of the principles of liberalism. Because sovereign power can always say, oh, the exceptions that we made at the time looked legitimate, but in hindsight they were actually errors. Anything but systemic problems. Okay, so we've said that the technology of race is used by sovereign power trying to preserve itself. We've covered the who, but preserve itself against what, exactly? Time to look at the why. Fortunately, this bit's pretty easy. Sovereign power wants to preserve itself against what Sheth calls the unruly. The unruly is that which is unpredictable, undependable, or threatening to a political order. Sovereign power does not make exceptions of people randomly. If your existence or the way you live threatens any of the basic liberal assumptions, or even as is often the case, if it's just perceived as a threat to them, then you're in danger of being marked as unruly. So for instance, if you openly display your private values in public, if you remind people that the law isn't always administered equally, if you actually need the welfare state in order to survive, then in the eyes of sovereign power, you can be a threat, whether they're consciously aware of that and whether you actually are or not. So sovereign power wants to preserve itself against perceived challenges from the unruly by making exceptions of people. It's time now to bring race back into this, tie all the threads together and explain how making those exceptions works. Racialization is the process by which a population is divided and one group is pushed further and further away from that promise of liberalism, both in the law and in the minds of the people. It is, quote, the process of delineating a population in contrast to a dominant population and the corresponding political tension. It is how sovereign power creates exceptions to its own rules and makes those exceptions seem totally legitimate and natural. Racialization protects sovereign power and suppresses the unruly because there's an implied threat of violence for those who can't get into the promised land. If you're in the group that's racialized and pushed out and you don't get the protection or the benefits or whatever it is, well then that'd be bad for you, wouldn't it? So you better stop being unruly and toe the line. Let's say that you and I represent sovereign power, and there's this group of people that we think are unruly and we want to racialize them. In order to do that, we first need two things. They need to have some distinguishing feature that we can use to point them out to the dominant population and say, look, there's the enemy. It could be a physical thing, like their skin colour, but it might not. It could be their religion or their socioeconomic status or their sexuality. If they don't have a distinguishing feature, then we could always try giving them one, like for instance, making them wear a yellow star or a red wristband. They also need to be vulnerable already compared to the dominant population, otherwise it's going to be very difficult for us to racialize and push them out. Maybe there's some historical inequality that hasn't been rectified, maybe they're not represented in positions of power, maybe they're new immigrants to our nation and they need our help to survive. We take their perceived unruliness and we say, everybody with that distinguishing feature is like that. And that's how we write them all off as bad and begin to justify excluding them from society as a race that we have effectively just created. Now, this bit is the hardest bit to understand. The distinguishing features then become the criteria by which sovereign power tells us it's making the distinction. It's actually distinguishing on the basis of unruliness, but it's disguising that as a neutral, objective, possibly biological category. Think about the lengths that the Nazis went to prove that Aryans were a different race from Jews or Poles or whoever they wanted rid of at the time. It's politics disguising itself as neutral, objective science. Sheth thinks that physiological markers like skin colour and genetics don't constitute race. Rather, those features are used to point out populations that are already being racialized and pushed out because sovereign power perceives them as unruly. That's why some biological differences, like skin colour, are thought to constitute race, and some biological differences, like hair and eye colour, are just natural variation within a race. Because the rules for deploying the concept of race don't come from biology, they come from power. All this theory might seem a bit abstract, so let's look at a concrete example. Consider the internment of Japanese Americans in the USA just prior to World War II. Many so-called Japanese Americans were actually American citizens, second or third generation descendants of Japanese immigrants. They could be distinguished on sight from the dominant white population. Their ancestors had faced obstacles like the alien land law and laws against mixed marriages, so compared to the white population they were already vulnerable. When the war started, the US government worried that they might rise up and commit mass sabotage. That was the perceived unruliness. And so, on President Roosevelt's orders, 120,000 people had their ordinary rights suspended and were imprisoned in concentration camps. The state took a bunch of people who were in their eyes potentially unruly, drew a line around them, said everybody within that line is the same in terms of their threat to us, regardless of how much individual evidence we may have for their cases, and used that line as an excuse to literally lock them up. So to sum up, the concept of race functions as technology in a threefold way. Firstly, it classifies people according to their perceived unruliness. Secondly, it disguises that classification under criteria that are politically neutral, like skin colour. And finally, it hides the true relationship of violence between citizens and sovereign power. Sheth's model of race is neither biological category nor social construct. Rather, race latches onto certain observable variations in humans, sometimes biological, sometimes not, and attaches socio-political importance to them in order to preserve power. And this might actually explain a lot. Discriminating against somebody because their skin is a different colour, it's difficult to understand why anyone would do that. But discriminating against somebody because you've been told people like them are a threat, suddenly that's a lot easier to understand. And it might explain a few things too, like how young black men in the US are much more likely to be thought threatening and therefore shot by the police than young white men. Race is more than just a biological category, it's a socio-political one. It's worth noting that once racialization becomes part of the law and the common discourse, we can perpetuate it without even meaning to or realizing. Sheth's work has the power to transform not only our understanding of race, but our understanding of racism. You might have heard people say, I'm not racist because I don't hate anyone because of the colour of their skin. Well, now we know there's more to race than that. We are better equipped to identify racist thinking in others and in ourselves. I've had the misfortune of meeting a few racists in my time, and they won't tell you that they hate people because of the colour of their skin. They'll tell you that people like that are aggressive or lazy or rude or whatever it is. You may have also heard people say you can't be racist towards white people, and at first glance that can look very odd. But if Sheth is right that race comes from power, given that white people have historically held the balance of power, we can see that racism is a more specialised and technical subset of discrimination. Obviously, if anyone were to just quote the dictionary definition of racism or the common definition of racism to try and refute that, they would be begging the question against all of Sheth's work. You would need to actually engage with her arguments. Which leads me, finally, to this. There are some final concerns to address before we finish part 1. Firstly, does this erase racial identity? Some people very proudly self-identify as members of a certain race, but if race is a tool of division and oppression created by the powerful, then aren't we taking that identity away from them? Sheth considers that and says no. Racial self-identity follows after a population has already been racialized. The racialized population learns from sovereign power to identify themselves as different from them. They are to be distinguished, and we can have both. Secondly, we've talked a lot about the failings of liberalism in this episode. Does that mean that liberalism as a project is doomed? That fairness and equality and justice can't be had? Well, not necessarily. But what we need to realise is that the ideal of a liberal society is one that we often fall short of. Fairness, democracy, equality, these might be worth striving for, but we need to recognise not only where we fail to get them, but also where we set ourselves up to fail. Some people, I'm sure, are going to say that Chef is redefining the word race, and you can't just redefine words. Well, hold your horses there, because she's not just plucking a new definition out of thin air,